In this lecture, we'll learn how to implement the selection control structure to make decisions about which pieces of code we execute as we run our game. And the C# statement we'll use to implement the selection control structure is the if statement. So what kind of decisions might we want to make? Well, we might need to decide how to move the player's avatar, in which direction to move that avatar, based on the player's input. We may decide whether an enemy drops loot. We may decide whether a player has leveled up. We could even decide which menu to go to when the player has done something, and there's lots more. So we make lots of decisions in our code as we develop our games, and the if statement helps us do that. Now that I've told you twice the name of the statement we use in C# to do selection, go ahead and take an in-video quiz about that. Okay, here's a pictorial representation of how an if statement works. So at the top node, we have a Boolean expression. Remember, an expression that evaluates to true or false. And in this particular picture, which is called a control flow graph because it graphs the flow of control, in this particular picture, the Boolean expression is GPA, grade point average, greater than or equal to 3.0. And if that Boolean expression evaluates to true, we take the branch marked true, the one on the left, and we execute the code there, and then we continue on our way. And if the Boolean expression evaluates to false, we take the false branch, the branch on the right, and just move right past the if statement and sort of move on to the code after that. Given that information, you should do another in-video quiz about some of the terminology I just shared with you. Okay, let's go start implementing if statements in MonoDevelop. This is the code we'll start with for this lecture. So I've done some commenting with our typical console app template, and I've added some code that prompts for and gets user input. So this asks whether the user wants to pick up a shiny thing, 1 for yes, 2 for no, and then it puts the result into this variable called answer, using the standard int.parse of the string we read from the keyboard, like we've done before. So now I want to print an appropriate message, and here's where we actually get to use an if statement. So I can give the user feedback about the decision they made. So I'll say if, and now I put the Boolean expression for the if between parentheses, and then the body of the if clause will go between curly braces. So I need a Boolean expression here that if it evaluates to true, I'll go do this stuff, whatever's between these curly braces, and if the Boolean expression evaluates to false, I won't do it. So let's give the yes, they picked up the shiny thing message first. So I'll say if answer equal 1. Now notice this is 2 equals to check for equality between the value of the answer variable and the 1 literal. It's not a single equal, which is for assignment. It's 2 equals. So if the answer is 1, we'll just say something. You have the shiny thing. And that way the user recognizes that we have acknowledged their decision. So I will run the code, and I'll say 1, and it says you have the shiny thing. And if I run the code and say anything other than 1, like 2, it doesn't give me that message, because this Boolean expression in that case, 2 is not equal to 1, so it doesn't execute the code in the body of the if clause. So there, at its most basic level, is the way that we can use the if statement to select which code we execute in our program. Now it might be the case that we want to do something when the Boolean expression is false as well, so we can certainly add something on that false branch. And the mechanism that we use in our if statement to include code for the false branch is something called an else clause. So now we'll go back to MonoDevelop and add an else clause to the code that we've already developed. So let's add a response to the user if in fact they haven't picked up the shiny thing. So I'll say else, and I'll say you don't have the shiny thing. So now if I control F5, 1, they have the shiny thing, and 2, they don't have the shiny thing. So the way this works is it checks this Boolean expression, and if it's true, it does this, and if it's false, it does this. It executes the code in the body of the else clause. Now, unfortunately, if I control F5 and the user's a dork and says 3, it says they don't have the shiny thing. And while it's true that they don't have the shiny thing because they didn't enter 1, they really messed up and gave us an invalid input. And I'd like to tell them that. So the way we can do that is we can turn this else into an else if answer equal to, and it will do that. And now we'll add an else that says console.writeline, well, console.writeline. And we should be courteous to the user, so we'll say invalid input dork. So the way this works is it will check this Boolean expression first, and if it's true, it will execute this code, and then it will jump all the way down to this console write line after the if statement. If this Boolean expression is false, it will go to the else if, and it will check this Boolean expression. And if this Boolean expression is true, it will execute this code, and then go to the console write line. But if this one is false, it will go to the else. If it gets to the else, there's no Boolean expression to evaluate. It's just going to execute this code in the body of the else clause. So now we'll control F5 and we'll check yes, you have the shiny thing, and we'll check no, you don't have the shiny thing, and we'll check a dork input, invalid input dork. So there you go. We've now used all of the pieces of the if statement. We've included an if clause, we've included an else clause, and we've included an else if clause. Now you can have as many else if clauses as you want, and as we saw at the beginning where we only had an if, you don't need to have an else clause if you don't want to. So there are a whole bunch of different combinations you can have. You always have to start with an if, but you can have 0 or more else ifs, and you can have 0 or 1 else clauses in your if statement. To recap, we've explored how we can use different variants of the if statement to implement the selection control structure in our code.